Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another chapter of AP Government. Today, we're going to be focusing a lot on foundations of American democracy and specifically that founding era where we move from the Declaration of Independence into the end of the Revolutionary War, our first form of government called the Articles of Confederation, and then into the Constitutional Convention, and what sort of vision develops for government in that process. So, one of the things I want you to think about, maybe as sort of the theme of this lecture, is how does the US move from a weak central government, more so a league of states, to a stronger national republic? And what sort of trade offs were involved in that process, right? What was the give and take? And ultimately, the end of this chapter is going to culminate with the Constitution. And the Constitution matters because it's the foundational framework for US government. It establishes our institutions, it creates the powers of those institutions, and sets up the rule book, more or less, for this new constitutional system. It's also grounded in a lot of the principles that we covered back in chapter one, things like liberties or freedoms, limited government, right? Many of the ideas that Thomas Jefferson had talked about in the Declaration of Independence carry their way forward during this time. So, as we move through this, we're going to be looking at specifically the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and how they move us into that constitutional era and that call for a stronger national government. We'll talk about the process of give and take, right? Compromise throughout this process. We'll look again at some of those constitutional principles like separation of powers and checks and balances and how those affect politics in the United States today. And then finally, we'll move into a period of ratification of the new Constitution, which is going to be that process of approving the new document as written. And out of that process comes two sort of core groups that are arguing for and against the ratification of this new constitution. We're going to call those groups the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and you'll be looking at their arguments and comparing their point of view. I want to start by setting the stage if we're thinking about sort of the experience that colonists were having prior to revolution. Up until the early 1760s, being a British colonial subject is pretty hands off. The British had allowed quite a bit of freedom and very limited restrictions, particularly in the Americas. And so that starts to change, that starts to shift. 1761 is the first piece of that. And the reason it's shifting is a result of the 7 Years' War. The British were colonizing the globe. With that comes conflict. One of those conflicts is the 7 Years' War, and there's debt. There's money to be paid, and they're looking to their colonial subjects that, in their view, benefited from the outcome and investment in that war to pay their price, to pay their share, right? The colonists, in their view, say we didn't ask for this, right? This was your guys' thing, and now you're going to make us pay for it. Okay. So it starts with the writs of assistance in 1761, which is going to allow British officials to search for smuggled goods. One of the benefits of colonization for the colonizers is going to be the economic benefits, having your colonists buy, sell, trade with you. And people here in the Americas were trading with other nations that were over here as well, right? The French were over here, the Spanish were over here. There were Native American tribes, obviously, across the Americas. And so the British are like, hey, we're going to crack down on you buying from people that aren't us, right? That's going to make us more money. Then we have the Proclamation of 1763, which is going to sort of set a boundary, keeping white settlers to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, requiring things like licensing for trade. And so the British kind of can have a closer eye on their subjects when it comes to trade as a result of this proclamation. And then we have taxes, right? Taxes, taxes. And so we have the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. By the time we get to the Tea Act in 1773, colonists are very much feeling that about every single everyday good that they purchase is taxed. And the tax is a problem. No one likes paying more taxes. But one of the greater sort of philosophical issues here is that these colonists had zero representation in the government that chose to tax them. And so taxation without representation sort of becomes the rallying cry, right? Of course, the fallout of the Tea Act is the Boston Tea Party, followed by more British crackdown through the Intolerable Acts. And ultimately, that's sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back and moves the colonists towards independence. So I want you to think about generally who these policies benefited, how and why they moved the colonies towards independence. So, kind of put that in your own words. And then thinking back to Chapter 1 and the Declaration of Independence, how does the Declaration of Independence address some of these issues, right? Some of these challenges, these grievances. If you can remember anything that Jefferson was talking about in that document, how is that document very much so a result of this historical time frame? Now, by the end of this, we're going to be looking at the Constitution. And one of the major players in the U.S. Constitution is going to be James Madison, right? Later a president, but at the time we think sort of a visionary and an architect of this system. He was sort of the secretary during the Constitutional Convention, and he took very in-depth notes about the discussions that they had in forming this new government. And he approached politics much like a researcher, right? He had studied why republics and democracies had collapsed, right? Why did the Roman Republic collapse? Those sorts of things. And generally, it was through things like civil conflict, takeover of elites, or that like imbalance of economic power and stability. And so he had looked at that. And his goal was to design a republic that could actually last, that could protect natural rights and prevent tyranny and the disorder that had resulted in the end of many republics in hindsight, right? And like I said, he serves as the major author of the Constitution, later will become its chief defender during ratification. He wrote the Federalist Papers. We're going to read one of those, a variety of those, but one of them written by him is Federalist number 10, where he talks about the importance of a large republic and upholding order, right? So he co-authored the Federalist Papers and becomes a major defendant of the Constitution by the end of this chapter. But before we get there, we got to talk about the Articles of Confederation, the way that we went right after the end of the Revolutionary War. So as the war is sort of coming to a close, even before then, our founders are hopeful about what this could look like if the American colonies win their independence. And so they start to think about what sort of government they might create as this new nation, right? And the first thing that they come up with is the Articles of Confederation, which is adopted by the Confederation Congress in 1777 and later ratified and put into effect in 1781. The entire idea behind the Articles of Confederation was to maintain state sovereignty. that in this system, states would be supreme and that they would design the national government to be intentionally weak. Now, I want to think about why that might be, right? They had just come from a monarchical sort of structure where there was only central government, and they felt misrepresented by the central government, and they felt the central government was big enough to abuse power, right? And so they're like an 18-year-old leaving their parents' home, and they are fed up with the rules, and they are going to go do everything opposite of what their parents would have wanted them to do, right? And so they create this very loose sort of league of friendship amongst the states. There was a unicameral legislature, that is one house with one representative from each state, regardless of the state's size, the state's number of delegates, right? You might have 8 people representing your state, only one of them gets to vote. That had challenges in itself, right? But we said this makes sense from the get go. We have a deep fear of centralized power after British rule, and so we run in the opposite direction. Now, there are a lot of weaknesses. There's a reason that the Articles of Confederation do not and cannot last. And so that's what we're going to spend the next few slides on here, right? The Articles of Confederation go into effect in 1781. Congress has written a new constitution by 1787. So this does not last long, right? Many challenges. The first is going to be no taxation. Okay. Congress could only request money from the states, and the states would say, get a life. We're not giving you money, right? This created a lot of economic stability. The national government was broke from the get go. They couldn't afford to pay the soldiers that had fought on their behalf in the Revolutionary War. And so there's a lot of economic stability. Congress would print money, but it wasn't reliably backed, right? Like it wasn't backed by the gold standard or a silver standard or anything like that. So the national government's money that they did have had very little value. There's no executive branch, right? No independent leader. They didn't want any king-like figure, so they said no executive, right? And so there was no single figure to look to enforce policy, to coordinate national policy, anything like that. There seemed to be a general lack of structure in that regard. There's also no national judiciary. So even if Congress creates a law, you have no executive branch to enforce it, and you have no federal court system to resolve disputes about it. You would have to lean on your states to uphold the law. And if the states didn't like the law, they didn't uphold it, right? One of the other major weaknesses is that this is really hard to amend. To make any changes to this document, you need 13 out of 13 states on board. Now, that is like impossible. And they find that out really quickly. And ultimately, it's going to be that major issue that causes them to kind of just toss this one in the trash and start anew with a new republic under the US Constitution. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the specifics of the economic collapse that results because of the loose structure created under the Articles of Confederation. So, on your note sheet, you can continue to add some about that. So, one of the major challenges here is that Congress, under this new sort of system, has no power to regulate commerce. So any commerce that was happening, that is economic activity that was happening between the states were given the responsibility or maybe the right to set their own trade barriers. And so they could impose tariffs or taxes on goods from other states. And ultimately, this undermines national trade goals. It also results in the states acting more like each other's competition rather than part of a unified economy. So you have some economic fragmentation that results, where you have some states that are really resource wealthy and their money is worth money, and you have other states that are sort of desperately poor within this system. And so it's not a great recipe for longevity. They recognize this fairly early on, and it's Ben Franklin who decides to pull together a group to discuss trade and navigation disputes as a result of the challenges we just mentioned. And so that meeting happened in Annapolis in 1786, and it was widely considered sort of a failed meeting because of all the states invited, so 13 states invited, only 5 of them actually chose to attend. And it really was a signal of how weak coordination amongst the states had become. And so at the Annapolis Convention, there was some general consensus amongst the small group that a larger convention of the states would be required to fix the system. And that's going to happen in Philadelphia in 1787. One of the key takeaways I think here is the Annapolis Convention is a great example of how even small groups, even limited numbers, can trigger some major institutional change. Especially when those problems are urgent. And so maybe that's a lesson for us as citizens as well, that even movements that feel small at the beginning can grow to be something much, much bigger in the end. We mentioned specifically that money was not backed by valuable things, right? There was a lack of hard money, that is, money backed by gold or silver. Of course, our money today is not backed by gold or silver, but it is different times, and changing that system at the time certainly resulted some economic fallout as well. So debt was really widespread after the revolution, and as a result, states started to raise taxes to pay off their debts, largely war related debts, and those taxes burdened their ordinary citizens. And so foreclosures, that is, closures on property, right, were increased substantially, especially in rural communities. And this starts to intensify anger, right? And there starts to be sort of this sense of those who have stuff and those who don't have stuff, right? And that economic pain ultimately becomes political pressure. And we can find many examples of that in world history, really, where you have that division of different classes of society, and that can result in chaos, right? This political pressure, we have sort of the average American at the time demanding relief, and elites start to fear the instability and disorder that is coming out of those demands. One great example of this is going to be Shays' Rebellion, which happens in 1786, the fall of 1786 into 1787. And it's this grassroots uprising in Massachusetts that's led by indebted farmers and veterans of the Revolutionary War. And they storm on the state house. They rebel to stop foreclosures and stop the debt collection because we don't have the money to give, right? And ultimately, the state of Massachusetts really struggled to suppress the rebellion, to calm the crowd, right? And they called on the National Congress to come help them out, right? Have the other states help us. Well, the rest of the states are like, this isn't my problem, right? And Congress had no funds, they had no forces to effectively help Massachusetts in suppressing this rebellion. And so the national impact here is that it convinced a lot of state leaders at the time that when needed, the Articles could not ensure order, stability, or security in society. And that is going to lead to uh, more agreement for some of the states that didn't attend in Annapolis to show up in Philadelphia in 1787. We talked about their inability to suppress rebellion. Those types of security threats, as well as the foreign policy limitations, are ultimately going to be a significant challenge in terms of how this new nation is seen across the globe. And so it, of course, faces real external threats. And there's very limited capacity to respond to those threats. They can't even handle the threats happening within their borders, right? The national government lacks funds to protect shipping and get goods safely into harbors. And diplomacy is just not effective. Our relationship with other nations, it's not working, right? States had retained so much power in ways that there was really no national collective bargaining that could happen with foreign powers. And so without that fiscal and military capacity, uh, the sovereignty of the new nation, the ability and authority to rule, is really fragile. And so, one of the things I want you to reflect on is if you were a state leader in 1787, which of these problems would most convince you we have to show up, we have to do something about the Articles of Confederation? And how would you defend your choice to go to other leaders who maybe didn't agree with you, weren't on the same page? I want to talk a little bit about the people who showed up here and their experience at this point and sort of the uniqueness of what becomes known as the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. Of course, they do not go with the intent to change this, I guess, scrap the Articles of Confederation. They go with the intent to amend it. But that becomes very challenging, right? Because if you remember from a few slides ago, we needed 13 of 13 states on board to be able to amend this thing, okay? But before we hop into the Constitutional Convention and the figures involved, I want you to take a minute to describe the colonial experience this far. And explain how they might correct the mistakes they have made this far. What things might they change in the US Constitution based on kind of what you know about US government today? And take a few minutes, pause me, jot down some notes on that, and then we'll talk about this, right? So, the Constitutional Convention, we have 55 delegates, that is representatives from 12 states, all but Rhode Island, that show up in Philadelphia. George Washington is going to be selected as the sort of presiding officer or the president of this convention. And is going to sort of lead the discussion throughout the process. He was, of course, someone who was well trusted as a general in the Revolutionary War, well trusted by a lot of states. He's from a big state, right, Virginia. And so he's kind of the guy that they look towards, right? James Madison is taking detailed notes, as I mentioned. Franklin and Hamilton, so Ben Franklin, the oldest guy at the time, comes in on a carried on a chair basically every day to the Constitutional Convention. And Alexander Hamilton are going to shape the debate. They're going to be a couple of the talkers, right? You can see a little bit of information about some of the people that were there, right? Many of them had been members of the Continental Congress or the Congress of the Confederation. They had served on their state constitutional conventions and signed the Declaration of Independence, had attended college, which was very rare for the time. And so in general, most of these people that are present they're mostly fairly young, right? The average age is 42. Of course, people didn't live as long back then, but if you compare it to the average age of people in government today, quite young. But regardless of their age, they're very well experienced and very well educated for the time. One thing that I think is unique about this convention is that they had immediately sort of agreed to a rule of secrecy. That everything that happened, what happens in this room stays in this room. And while that lacks transparency for the public, it did enable a lot of bargaining and compromise without the involvement of the public and without the possibility of immediate public backlash. They, of course, maintain their commitment to things like liberty and natural rights, and there's early agreements on things like separation of powers and checks and balances, but it's sort of the uh, more detailed areas. It's not the principles that they disagree with each other on, it's some of the specifics. And so there's some compromises made in that process. A couple of the major problems that come out are in dealing with representation and power. So, how should states be represented? Should it be equal? Should we do one per state, two per state? Should it be based on their population? Some states are incredibly populated, others are not. How strong should the national government be? What does that look like? And how do we protect individual rights and liberties while creating a government that is strong enough to govern with some efficiency, which obviously was lacking in the Articles of Confederation? On your sheet here, you have some early constitutional protections. We many times think of the Bill of Rights, which is not part of the original Constitution, is sort of the foundation of some of the rights and protections that are offered to Americans through the Constitution. But there are a variety of things that are covered by the original body of the Constitution. And so those are listed out here. You have, for example, no religious tests for federal office. Religious tests for state offices were more common at the time, not so much today, right, with that commitment to the First Amendment. Habeas corpus is protected, except in case of rebellion. And habeas corpus, again, we like to use kind of Latin phrases, but that's going to be unlawful imprisonment, right? Just being thrown in jail for no reason, right? Or for a reason that's not true, right? Or something like that. No bills of attainder. That means the government can't assume you guilty without trial. No ex post facto laws. Those are going to be laws that go into effect retroactively. So, say 18th Amendment outlaws alcohol. If you drank before the 18th Amendment, they're not going to send you to jail, right? It wasn't illegal at the time. So that's an ex post facto law. Trial by jury is guaranteed under Article 3. It's reinforced again later in the Bill of Rights amendments. And then you have some narrowly defined crimes, specifically treason. And treason has some very strict standards of proof that are required under the original Constitution. Out of the question on representation, or out of that issue, comes two major plans for government. One being pitched by the state of Virginia and the other being pitched by the state of New Jersey. And so these are sort of the competing blueprints. On this slide, I have some information I want you to sort into a Venn diagram. You can find the textbook reading on the Virginia and New Jersey plans on page 34 of your textbook. So that should help you organize some of this information, right? But the Virginia plans brought forward by James Madison, it creates three branches, which is agreed to on both sides, a bicameral legislature, which is going to mean two houses. Virginia is a large state at the time, definitely going to be more in favor of the large states. And the New Jersey plan is brought by a delegate under the name Patterson. It's going to represent small state interests, right? More equality in representation. And the conflict over this was intense because ultimately representation is going to determine political power for decades or now centuries to come, right? As a small state, North Dakota, we can see how North Dakota has limited control and access in the House of Representatives, right? We only have one out of 435 seats. So this is an intense debate and one that they know matters in terms of how this country moves forward, okay? But the fundamental tension is really large states wanting a large amount of influence, small states being threatened by that, having fear of being dominated. And so this sort of sets the stage for what we're going to call the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Of course, pitched by the state of Connecticut, and it creates a bicameral Congress. So two House, one of which is represented by the population. So more seats when you have more people. It's directly elected. It's viewed as sort of the most representative entity in government. And then you have the Senate. The Senate is equal representation with 2 senators per state. Originally, they're chosen by state legislatures. That goes away with the addition of the 17th Amendment. And then ultimately, the political effect of this at the time is that small states have sort of a structural defense in the Senate. Where they do have equal control, they can put forward a resistance. And the long-term consequence of this, we have sort of a persistent tension between people-based and state-based representation that continues to shape U.S. politics. One of the other things that comes in the Great Compromise is this idea of the Electoral College, which is going to be our system for electing the president. And I think it's a great example of where we continue to have that tension between people-based and state-based representation. Smaller states are overrepresented proportionally, right? But then you have big states like California, right? 54 electoral votes that carry a lot of influence, right? Even if their per person breakdown isn't as large. So it's an ongoing debate. Maybe not one we have as much about the House or the Senate today, but certainly one that comes forward in our discussion of the Electoral College. There were a variety of compromises that were made regarding the issue of slavery as well, right? There were some Northern delegates at the time that were ready to do away with slavery, right? Because it really is a direct contradiction of the values put forth in the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That doesn't jive with this, right? And so there were some delegates that were ready to move forward with that. But ultimately, there was no chance of drumming up enough Southern support for this new form of government if they were going to outlaw slavery here and now, right? And so they did a few things. When it came to the issue of representation, the major compromise is the Three-Fifths Compromise, originally located in Article 1, Section 2. later overturned with the Reconstruction Amendments. And ultimately, it says enslaved people will count as 3/5 of a person when it comes to congressional representation, uh, taxation, so on and so forth. There was a compromise on importation, which prohibited the restriction of the slave trade until 1808, so about 20 years. They're going to say essentially their compromise is this is a discussion for later, not for now, right? And then the fugitive slave provision that's found in Article 4, which is about relationships between states, required that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers, even if they had fled to free states. So, certainly not living up to the Declaration of Independence in this regard at the time. Now, this page, these slides, we're going to hop around this page a little bit here, but this new Constitution creates a republic or a representative democracy. It's grounded in the constitutional principles that you see on the screen here: separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. Now, when it comes to separation of powers, there's actually separation both within the federal government and through federalism, right? So within the federal government, you have things like, the legislative branch can make laws, the executive can enforce laws, the judicial can interpret laws. But ultimately, within the system of federalism, we also have that further division of government power between national government and the states. And this is sort of a new idea in practice, that you would have two co-equal levels of government. We're kind of curious how this is going to work, right? And I'm not going to go too in depth on that because chapter 3 is all about federalism. But really, these structures and features of this new constitution create multiple access points for political change through my state policy, through laws, through the courts, through executive action. There's all sorts of avenues to access and change government as a result of these policies. Now, this is an overview of the three branches, some of their powers I would note on your sheet. I would also note where we find information on these branches in the Constitution. It's largely going to be Article 1 is legislative power, Article 2 is executive power, and Article 3 is judicial power. Now, there are some exceptions. There's sort of an extension. I would say in Article 6, you have the Supremacy Clause, which is going to make federal law supreme over state law when they come into conflict, or the Constitution really is the supreme thing we're going to look towards, or the courts are going to look towards to determine the constitutionality of actions, right? And that process of determining constitutionality of laws, statutes, so on and so forth, is called judicial review. In judicial review, we actually don't find within the Constitution itself. It is written about in Federalist 78, which we'll read later on in the year, but it's not really established until Chief Justice John Marshall exercises the practice of judicial review for the first time in a case called Marbury versus Madison, which comes before the court in 1803. Now, Marbury versus Madison is more or less a dispute over some justice of the peace appointments. If you remember from U.S. history, there were midnight appointments as John Adams is leaving office and Thomas Jefferson is coming in. This is the first time in U.S. government or history where political parties have shifted. And so the Federalists, John Adams and the Federalists are like, how do we maintain some longevity in government even once Jefferson takes over. And Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. And so the midnight appointments, Adams, his administration appoints a bunch of these justices of the peace in the final days of his presidency to fill those positions with Federalist supporters. Now, there's a lot of sort of weird details about this, but basically, John Marshall in this time period goes from being the guy who was supposed to deliver the job offers to being the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. When when Jefferson comes into office, Madison is actually his Secretary of State. So even though James Madison is a strong defender of the Constitution prior to its ratification. He's no longer at this point in time a member of the Federalist Party. He had sort of feuded with guys like Alexander Hamilton over sort of the growth of federal power that had happened early in the Republic. So Madison is going to work for Jefferson. And this guy, William Marbury, he was one of those that was supposed to get this Justice of the Peace job. He doesn't get it because Madison doesn't deliver the job offer when he comes in. And he looks to the courts and say, hey, force them to give me my job. You have the power to force the executive into compliance under something called the Judiciary Act of 1789. The power specifically was called a writ of mandamus. And in this decision, John Marshall actually decides that he doesn't view it as a legitimate constitutional power that the judiciary should be able to force the executive to do anything. The Supreme Court throws the president in jail. We don't think that should happen, right? And so they overturn a portion of the Judiciary Act that would have allowed for relief for William Marbury, that would have given him his job. A lot of stuff, right? It's kind of political in nature, but the general impact of this case is that this is the first time the court uses that process of judicial review, and it sets judicial review as an important precedent and one that the court uses constantly up to the present, right? They are constantly reviewing the constitutionality of state statutes, federal statutes, all kinds of things, executive actions, you name it. If you flip ahead in your note packet here, you will find some space to write out the amendment and ratification process that's agreed to at the Constitutional Convention. I will tell you that step number 1 is how the vast majority of things go, right? Pretty much every constitutional amendment has been proposed by Congress, okay? So Congress, 2/3 of both houses, so the House of Representatives and the Senate, must vote to propose the new amendment. The other option is step 2, which is a proposal by the states. So if you can't get Congress on board, well, then call for a convention of the states, right? Where 2/3 of state legislatures can call for a constitutional convention to propose amendments. That's a lot of work. This method has never been used, okay? So most of the time, we're going to cross step 2 out. It's not going to happen, okay? We're going to go immediately from step 1 to step 3. Now, thousands of amendments are proposed, and the vast majority of them will never get through step 1. But those that do, lots of times go to step 3 here then, which is ratification, which is going to require 3/4 of the states, currently 38 of the 50, to ratify the proposed amendment, either through their state legislatures or through state conventions. This is designed to be a slow and difficult process that requires both levels of government to engage, state government and national government, right? Now the original Constitution, or sorry, the Articles of Confederation, their amendment process, we said, had a unanimous requirement, right? 13 out of 13 had to be on board. We're going to amend that here, right, with 2/3 and then 3/4. Ultimately, the articles also had required 13 out of 13 to ratify, to approve it, and use that as our form of government. The Constitution bypasses that rule. And they say, in order for this new Constitution to go into effect, all of it, right? We're going to need 9 of the 13 states to ratify this Constitution. Now, they do eventually all do it. And actually, by the time they get the 9th to ratify the Constitution, they're not ready to put it into effect anyway, because they're still waiting on votes, ratification votes, from 2 major populated states, that is New York and Virginia, where the battle over ratification was quite intense. So 9 out of 13 states are required to put this new Constitution into effect, and that is going to move us into the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, okay? This is the ratification debate. I'm not going to go over a ton of this because you're going to do more research on their perspectives and compare and contrast them. But the Federalists are represented by people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, and they're going to argue that the Constitution, this new Constitution, is essential to prevent chaos and to protect liberty. And they're going to write a lot of Federalist papers. To name a few, they're going to write Federalist number 10 is written by Madison, talks about the importance of a large republic in preventing small angry groups from dominating. You have Federalist 51, which is going to be about separation of powers and self-interest and checks and balances and all of those important elements. We'll later get to Federalist number 39, which again is about this Republican form of government. You have the Anti-Federalists then, who are represented in the press under the pen name Brutus, okay? But you can assume that maybe guys like Jefferson would have seen more valid points in the Anti-Federalist argument, right? He's actually overseas at the time, right? If you've seen the Hamilton musical, comes back, what did I miss, right? But the Anti-Federalists fear that consolidation of power. They fear this idea of standing national armies, of broad taxation authority, of just a general lack of state sovereignty. And their most important critique and bargaining chip is going to become the Bill of Rights. They're going to argue that this new Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. And ultimately, that's going to become a compromising piece, right? Like, if you give us our Bill of Rights, maybe we'll give you a ratification vote, right? And so we think of these Anti-Federalists as sort of the states' rights advocates during this debate. They would have liked to see something closer to the Articles of Confederation. Now, of course, in this debate, there is going to be moderates on both sides, right? Moderates that are going to vote for the Constitution while also thinking it could really use a Bill of Rights. It could really use a few adjustments, right? And there's going to be moderates on the anti-Fed perspective as well. So that is a wrap on Chapter 2. If you have any questions, you know where to find me, and have a great rest of your day.